the last official thing of the day. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our only invited speaker of this 20th finals, Gregoire Winterstein. So maybe many people know what he's done, but he's done many, many things actually up to the present, which I won't list because maybe you know. If you don't know, you should go look at his website because there's many, many interesting things there, and there are papers associated which you should read. But one of the things he's done is argumentation, and this we hear about today.
Thank you very much, Eddie. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me. Of course, it's very much appreciated, especially because Lenox has a very special place in my heart. It was the first international conference I attended 10 years ago as a grad student. And among the many 15, yes, we all 20 years old. Were you paying attention this morning? Yes. So, besides meeting Chris, I had many interesting experiences, including Ellen telling me that my talk was boring and not interesting. And it was about argumentation. Yes, really. It's been haunting me ever since. So I try to do better this time. I do my better. Okay, so let's go for argumentative meaning, semantics with our purpose. So, like Chris, actually, full disclosure, parts of what I'm going to talk about today, I've been talking about in other places, although never all of it in the same place at once. And some of those ideas here, especially in the second section, are actually rather new and still very much work in progress. So I hope to get feedback from all of you about these. But so first, argumentation. What do I mean by argumentation? I mean something, an activity that we do as speakers of natural language, which is aimed at changing the beliefs of an audience, typically the addressee, but also potentially people who are watching the conversational exchange. And how do you do this? Through the presentation of some evidence. And typically you do it by linguistic means. But that doesn't mean that I think that argumentation is essentially a linguistic thing. You can certainly convince people by using pictures, people who work in advertisement notice, a lot of nice settings, pretty people, they're a good selling point for whatever it is that you want to sell. But I'm only considering linguistic argument, language-based argument. And the main claims that I basically try to defend are that parts of natural language meaning are inherently argumentative. That is another way to put it, that argumentation is inscribed within the linguistic code. And so in the description of some of the linguistic items in the description of their semantics, we should think about the semantics in terms of argumentation. So why argumentation? Well, first argument for argumentation is empirical, and it's the sort of irregularity that has been noted by mostly French semanticists. It's a French thing to argue. Maybe that's why I think it's universal, right? Me being French. But look at those examples. I'm done with my beer. I'm almost done with my beer. I'm barely done with my beer. In terms of entailment, 1b entails that 1a is false. So if you're almost done with your beer, it means your beer is not finished. You still have some in your glass. And if you say I'm barely done with my beer, it entails that 1a is true. You're done. Usually nobody complains when I say that. We have experimental data that shows that indeed that's what speakers of French, but also English, have those judgments. So far, so good. But even though we have those entailment patterns, what we find is that in terms of how you can use those discourses, those elements in actual discourses, they differ. So you can say, I'm done with my beer, and use this as an argument to have another one. Get me another one. And you can also use 1B, but of course you can't say, I'm very done with my beer. Get me another one. That would sound weird. Whereas I'm almost done with my beer. Get me another one. Sounds fine. And here the observation is that, well, since you're done with your beer in 1C, or your state of advancement in beer drinking is more advanced in 1C than in 1B, you should have an even better reason to want another beer in 1C than in 1B. Yet somehow that doesn't give you good grounds to conclude that you want another one. That's not how people use those sentences. So we have a mismatch in terms of entailment patterns and discourse orientation, which I will eventually call argumentative orientation. So that's one thing. Another example, I have many of them, I won't cover all of them, so I'm just going to do 2 examples today to introduce the theory, is the lexical semantics. So you have pairs like stingy or amither on one hand, and thrifty on the other hand. So Alex is stingy, Alex is thrifty. In terms of denotation, probably those things would pick out more or less the same people. So if you think of, the meaning of thrifty as the set of people who are thrifty, it's a very informative kind of lexical semantics that we do sometimes. You most likely will pick up people who are reluctant to spend money, but they're the same one that other people could describe as stingy. But obviously they are very, very different. And what makes stingy and thrifty differ, just like pray and beg, those are examples given by Aristotle already, as far as I remember. They sort of describe the same kind of action, but they give different, what some people call connotations to those properties, right? So they seem equivalent in terms of descriptive content, but yet there are obvious differences to any speaker of English. And of course, they can be used in very different discursive scenarios. So what I propose to do is to interpret discourse orientation, as I told you, within the theory of argumentation within language, which is, as I mentioned, mostly a French thing due to Oswald Ducrot and Jean-Claude Anscombre. And discourse orientation is basically an argumentative property. The core claim, as I said, is argumentation is inscribed in the linguistic code. Here's a quote by Anscombre and Ducrot. The argumentative possibilities in a discourse are tied to the global linguistic structure of the utterances, not just the content they convey. And discourse coherence is governed by argumentative constraints. Some utterances, E1, by giving the best reasons in the world to admit other utterances, E2, are nevertheless incapable in a discourse, an actual genuine discourse, to serve as arguments in favor of E2. Right? So that was the almost very examples, for example. So the idea that part of natural language meaning is not solely descriptive, that we have more than just denotational meaning, is not novel by any stretch. For example, if you look at the works of Roman Jakobson, he describes 6 functions of language, including a cognitive function, one that is centered on the relationship with the addressee, between a message and its audience, and under which you can put argumentative meaning. Okay, so usually when we illustrate cognitive function, we mention things like imperatives, because you want to put an effect on your addressee, but convincing your addressee of something also falls under that umbrella, right? And then you have many approaches that more or less explicitly focus on meaning that is non-descriptive, right? So Ginsberg, in his book, describes interactive meaning. And his point is like, if you stick to denotational meaning, you will not be able to describe the semantics of certain items like yes, no, And for these, you will need to add the idea that something is intrinsically interactive in natural language. And then others, some of the key party are present in this room, study expressive meaning, which is sort of a wastebasket, right? Anything that is not denotational, we put it as expressive, and then we don't know what it means, but we know it exists, right? What do you mean? And then we also have social meaning, right? So people like Eric Acton, Heather Burnett, they study all those parts of meaning that are related to the fact that, well, we use language to send signals about our social status, but social status also affects how our modes of expression. So in a way, argumentative meaning is just one other kind of meaning. Unlike the French people who are a bit extremists on that side, who say everything is argumentative and that's all there is to it. I'm just proposing to add argumentative meaning to the list of the kinds of meaning that an utterance conveys. We can keep the truth condition. Another argument for argumentation is that if you look at philosophical traditions throughout time and space, you will see that rhetoric seems to be a very general human concern. People have extensively been writing about rhetoric. So from ancient Egypt, one of the first books that we have is a rhetorics manual, and it's the teachings of an aging vizier to his son. And basically what he teaches his son is how to speak properly in order that people will listen and obey. And you will also find extensive discussions of rhetorics in Chinese and some traditions in Chinese philosophy, like Mohism, the school of names, also in Indian philosophy in the Nyaya school, also in Nahuatl philosophy in Central America, etc., etc. Usually, as soon as you start digging, you will find people who have said things about, oh, what is acceptable in terms of discourse? What should one say? How should one say things if they want to be convincing, effective in conversation? Which in passing means that argumentation is not an activity that emerges from ancient Greek democracy, as many authors have claimed. The idea is that, oh, well, it emerged argumentation when at some point during ancient Greece, people had to defend themselves in court, and so they had to start thinking about how to be effective. Well, it's not just the Greek. Even the Pharaoh, living God, had to speak properly. And then another aspect in which we can argue for argumentation is that it seems we can argue that it's indeed general in natural language communication. So when you look at argumentation theory works, they usually restrict it to certain genres of discourse. Judiciary discourse, that sort of thing, so advertisement discourse, a genre where the speaker is explicitly engaged in trying to convince the audience. But we can argue that it's more pervasive, actually. It happens all the time. Why? When we speak, as you probably know, when the speaker says something, they expect that the audience will ground the information. They will accept it, update the common ground with whatever it is that the speaker is saying. But it's not by far a straightforward process. And people who have been looking into it, well, some of them focus on the fact that audiences are epistemically vigilant. They pay attention to who says what, and they don't accept anything freely. And your reliability sometimes is affected by signals that you do not fully control. People might have biases, and yes, they might. Not against me, because I'm white, maybe. etc. I'm privileged, but others less so, right? So this, of course, comes into play when somebody is assessing your discourse mood. So language gives you actual tools to negotiate those sort of obstacles to pushing your content into the common ground. And another thing is that grounding is usually typically signal. This is the norm rather than the exception. So people like Clark have done extensive conversation analysis and found that if you count how many times people signal their acceptance, it outweighs the number of times where acceptance is cited. So the idea is that it's not free. You cannot just expect that people will ground whatever you say. So how do you do this? Well, you argue, right? So speakers should provide evidence to their audience in order for the audience to accept whatever it is they're conversationally trying to do. Namely, they have to argue. And the last thing, people like Mercier Sperber, they even propose that actually human reasoning developed because we needed it to argue in an effective way rather than the other way around. So again, yeah, French. Pretty extreme, but why not? And so, what are the elements of a theory of argumentation within language? Well, as I said, within that theory, we will consider that any utterance is interpreted relative to an argumentative goal. That is, when speakers speak, they do it with a certain purpose in mind. And your utterance can argue for or against the goal. It can do it with a certain strength. Some arguments are good, others are better. And that goal is not always explicit, so it should be recovered by something like abductive reason. But it's crucial in the interpretation of the sentence. And there are two versions of argumentation within language. As I said, there's a weak version, which is the way we go, where you have truth conditions, you have argumentative content, they coexist, possibly along other dimensions of meaning. And you have the very strong argumentativism where everything is argumentative. And you derive things like descriptive truth conditions. They only make mere inferences. We will not go that way today. Maybe when I get older. They're old. Maybe that's why they went that way. So what do we have within the theory of argumentation within language? Mostly three big chunks. Argumentative operators, they convey argumentative content. So there are things like the usual suspects, the adverbs, adverbial expressions, connective to. So things like only or barely, what they do, they invert the argumentative orientation of their adjacent. So Lucas has a PhD. Lucas only has a PhD. They argue in different ways, but in both cases, Lucas has a PhD. Others are better described as weakeners, things like almost or maybe, and others possibly as strengtheners. They're a bit more difficult to find, but in Cantonese, team is a sentence form particle, and they can have this meaning. And then you have connectives that explicitly relate the argumentative profiles of the utterances they connect. So, but is a very good example. It tells you that the two things it connects are arguing for in opposite ways. Then you have things like to and that encode some sort of argumentative orientation. Things like above all or even that will tell you that one out of two arguments, one is better than the other, etc. Then you have argumentative discourse laws that have a more general scope. We're going to see a few of them today. And it's going to be more clear what they do. And then you have lexical elements that have argumentative possibilities that we will refer to as topoi in their semantics. And taken together, those three sort of things composed together to give you the profile, the argumentative profile of an utterance. And so you look at the argumentative profile of the lexical elements at play. You see how they are affected by the argumentative constraints conveyed by some of the operators. And then you check whether some discourse laws apply to the argument that you get, and then you get the final argumentative value of your utterance. That's more or less the idea. Not more or less. And so today I want to talk about three things, maybe two, because time is running because of all the jokes. Argumentative meaning and types of content, but specifically the question of argumentative goals and questions under discussion and the notion of being at issue, which is a new thing that I've been thinking about and I have trouble with. So I will try to make it sound coherent. And then I'm going to illustrate one case of argumentative law, two actually, one will be very short, show how we can derive those laws once we adopt a probabilistic framework in which we interpret what it means to argue. And depending on time, I'm going to look at lexical argumentative contents and talk about argumentative topoi and how we can try and connect these to very modern things like the representations offered by large language models as developed in artificial intelligence. So, no, okay, sorry. As you probably know, approaches to discourse semantics can be based on the concept of a QUD, question under discussion. And basically there, the idea is that every utterance is understood as addressing some underlying question, the question under discussion, right? And as I said, within argumentation, within language, the idea that the speaker of an utterance targets some argumentative goal, which is also a way to capture the discourse topic, right? So they seem kind of parallel, and it's simple enough to propose that, well, the question under discussion is just putting a question mark in front of the goal, and it's whether G. Is it the case that G, the speaker is addressing that question? So you could easily relate the two perspectives. But a closer examination shows that the QUD-based view is somehow problematic when it comes to define what it counts as being an issue. And I illustrate it with the case of proximal adverbs, things like almost. So to come back to almost, here's one example of analysis, the one I will adopt. Lambdas, yeah. Leno's requirement, check. So the main content of an adverb like almost, it avoids some property, gradable property, and it tells you that the degree to which that property stands is higher than the standard for the property minus some epsilon. Just below, indistinguishably close to having the standard. That's where you are, and barely is the other way around. And the ancillary content, I don't want to call it presupposition or conventional implicature or anything else. Secondary content, non-main content. How I'm going to call it is essentially that you don't have the property in question. You're below it. So to illustrate with an example, Alex was almost late to the meeting. The idea is that it means that Alex arrived at some time t prox, such that t prox is after some time which is minimally before the time of being late, but also that came before. Yes, it's after some time which is minimally before, but it's also before the time at which they should arrive. So they're not late, but they're very close to being late. The not late part is ancillary, and the very close to being late is at least very close to being late is the main content. And of course, when you take the two contents together, you get the usual proper meaning of almost. So far, so good. And within a QUD-based approach to discourse semantics, a proposition P is an issue relative to a question Q, if and only if, whether P is relevant to Q. Namely, if answering whether P has an answer which entails an answer to Q. And so in an utterance of the form almost P as in 5, which is a favorite example of the argumentation. People, is dinner ready? Yes, almost. What's happening? You say yes, but you also say no at the same time. So you're giving two contents that address the QUD. Obviously they do. But that basically give you things that resolve the QUD, that answer the QUD in different ways. Right? So in that definition of being at issue, both contents conveyed by almost should be at issue because both have the potential to answer the QUD. The problem is that they answer the QUD in opposite ways. But nobody is like, what do you say? Yes, almost. I mean, yes, maybe some people will say, well, if it's almost ready, then it means it's not. But nobody likes these people. Okay. And then the question of projection. So projection is actually difficult to test with proximal adverbs, a bit like it was for only because they don't, I find the sentences where we try to embed things like almost under the usual family of sentences rather difficult to make natural. So if you have ideas, help me. Negation is the worst. It's false that he was almost late or whatever. Sounds like a sentence from a logician rather than a human being. And so, as you probably know, Mandy Simmons and colleagues, Gregoire Roberts, David Beaver, Judith Tannhauser, they propose that at issueness is related to projection, projectivity of content. Basically, you project if you're not at issue, right? Namely, not at issue to the current question or the discourse question. And so in 6, how's the progress on the Berthier report? And Alex answers, good. It might be almost finished as we speak. So here, might. That's the model family of sentences. I choose the model because that's, I find that it's the most natural one under which to embed almost. And the question is, does the fact that the report is not finished project out of the model or not? Well, the prediction is that it should not project because the report not being finished is relevant to the question of the boss. And indeed, that seems to be the case. Like, Alex doesn't seem to be committed to the fact that the Berthier report is not finished. So far, so good. But what about another example that looked like it, except that it's not the Berthier report? It's an ambulance driver, and somebody is in the back, and they're in a very bad shape. And the ambulance driver asks the paramedic, should I hurry, put on the headlights? Yes, they might be almost dead. Does that entail that the patient might not be dead, or is it stronger? Does it actually entail that the patient is not dead? The status of the patient is certainly an issue, but it only makes sense to hurry if the patient is not dead. Once the patient is dead, well, too late. No need to hurry to the morgue. All right. So we should expect some projection here. But given that the status of the patient is at issue, it should not project according to YouTube-based accounts. What? No, you cannot ask questions. Maybe you can. I don't care.
makes sense to them as long as you're not sure that. Assume that there is some. Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that, in fact, it makes sense to hurry as soon as you're not sure that they're dead. So I disagree with what you wrote there.
What I wrote is that it seems that it projects that it's about what the paramedic says, right? Damn it. Can you go back? Yes. When the paramedic says, yes, they might be almost dead, my intuition is that the paramedic is committed to the patient not being dead.
I don't know. I mean, maybe the paramedic is not sure, and it's because they're not sure.
That's why
that
that's a
it
question
makes
mark.
sense to hurry.
But yeah,
Committed to, so you put the question mark because you're not sure whether it projects that they might not be dead, or because you don't know the patient is not dead.
I'm not sure whether it entails this or the patient is not dead.
Okay.
Yes. My intuitions are shaky. More shaky than the Berthier report, for which I'm pretty sure. Where am I going with this? That Alex is not committed to the report being finished or not. So somehow the status of the patient, my intuition, is at issue in a different way than that of the Berthier report. But not in a way that is straightforward to capture within a QUD-based approach, unless one assumes some ad hoc contextual accommodation of the right questions, which is a thing they do in later papers. So how do we view this in argumentative terms? Well, we consider that the argumentative orientation of an utterance is based on the main content necessarily. That's what the main content is there for. You have to take the main content into account, and then any other content that contributes to the same goal as the main content. So if you have secondary content and tertiary content that somehow boosts your argumentation, you're free to take it in the calculation of the argumentative orientation. And so in the Berthier report, any degree of investment beyond being proximally close to completion counts as good, including the completion of the report, right? So the ancillary content would be a counter argument to the main content, and so it gets skipped. Because it's disoriented with the main content. Whereas in the case of the ambulance, the ancillary content is actually potentially improving your argument. Not only are they very close to being dead, but also they are not dead. So press the pedal. Okay. Or at the very least, and maybe that's why my intuitions are more shaky, is it doesn't hurt to take it into account or to assume that it projects. It could very well be the case, and it could be safe. It wouldn't affect the speaker's argument. So proposal is that what is at issue, what we should consider to be at issue is what contributes to the speaker's goal rather than what addresses the QUD. Because sometimes you have things that address the QUD in opposite ways. And operators like negation models, also answerhood. In the case of is dinner ready? Yes, almost. They bear on what is at issue. So here are a couple of other examples. If they were almost promoted, they have a good chance for next time. Somehow here, the fact that they were not promoted matters for the argument, and that you have a good chance for next time. Well, it's only relevant if you have not been promoted in the context I have in mind, versus if you have almost finished, you can go home. If you have finished, you can go home too, by the same principle. Right? Or did you almost sweat like you intended? I asked Ellen, who once told me that the perfect exercise is to bike to work. almost sweat. So you're not dirty to come into your office, but you have done a lot of exercise. Yes, you remember? Yes. So I asked you, did you almost sweat like you intended? You say yes. What do you mean? If you had actually sweated, you would say no. So when you say yes, it means you were in that proximal zone, but before sweating, versus the Berthier report, where any state beyond proximity close, including completion, would count as a yes. So link with projection is not so obvious. I mean, in a way, yes. But observe that the Berthier report not being complete is not an issue, yet it does not project in our sense. And in the ambulance case, the patient not being dead is an issue. It seems to project, but also you could get that projection in terms of effect of context. People, when you put them in the ambulance, you are under the impression they're not dead. So maybe that's where it comes from. But so summary, I try to redefine at issueness in terms of relevance to the speaker's goal. Let's say speakers speak to a point rather than try to determine the state of the world by answering a set of questions. It's a very, I don't buy we're trying to determine what is the state of the world when we talk story. And I rather have the story where we're trying to convince others to adopt our points of view. So some linguistic expressions conventionally convey content in a way that allows the speaker to push those content aside if it doesn't suit their communicative goal. So language gives you ways of doing this. But somehow they still remain committed to it. They also can act conversationally as if without not taking them into account. And this entangling the speaker's commitment from what they offer at issue is a difficult task. It's coherent actually with conclusions of the Marnet, Simmons, and Tonhauser when they were trying to annotate speakers' commitment in actual examples. So if you know the commitment bank, this big corpus where in a lot of embedded cases, they are trying to see whether things project or not. And they ask people to annotate, is the speaker committed to the truth of the complement of a number of verbs? And what I find is the picture is very murky. It's not as clear as we would like it to be. Context plays a very important role, and projection is something that is very gradable, very context dependent. What, in my words, depends on what the speaker is trying to achieve with their utterance. It also sheds light on potential difficulties for annotators. So maybe some annotators actually were, instead of annotating speaker's commitment proper, they were annotating things like what the speaker is offering at issue, the main content that the speaker is pushing. And that's it for the question under discussion. The 21 minutes that remain include the question. Yes, okay, fine. So discourse laws. Discourse laws are easy and more stable. So what they do, discourse laws, they're les lois de discours. They are introduced within argumentation to explain, capture regularities that go beyond individual items and constructions. So we have things like the negation law that postulates in Anscombe and Ducrot's terms that standard descriptive negation will flip the argumentative orientation of the host, of the prejacent. The lowering law is one that has to do with gradable expressions. I won't go into details. The inversion law, I will give you an example, tells you that if you have two arguments co-oriented, one is better than the other. If you negate them, you get a reversed order. What was the strong argument, you negate it, it becomes weak. What was the weak argument, you negate it, it becomes strong for the opposite conclusion. And the weakness law is something that says that if your argument is too weak, it becomes a counter argument. So it's like the Grice example with the recommendation letter for a professor of philosophy job, and you set it this person has a nice handwriting at the end. It's not bad. It's not good enough. So we can't counter argument. And there are many others. And as far as modeling argumentation is concerned, I said in classical view of the French view of argumentation within language, the relation argue, the one that relates premises and conclusion, is a primitive. You don't try to make sense of what it means, just assume that it's there somehow. But it can be given, if you want, a Bayesian interpretation, or it says some content A argues for conclusion C, if and only if what? The probability, Bayesian probability, means degree of belief. So your belief in the conclusion after learning that A is the case is higher than it was before. So basically, learning that A is the case boosted your belief that C is the case. This is the standard way of defining argumentative relations in the Bayesian setting. You can add additional constraints, especially if you're trying to set normative perspectives on argumentation, namely what's good argument, what's an acceptable argument, sort of things. But within that approach, it's also possible to prove or disprove some of the discourse laws that I just mentioned. And in the case of the negation law, which again was postulated, so Anscombe and Ducrot, they just assume that the law exists because they observe it. They're not trying to derive it, but you can derive it in that setting. It's pretty simple. So that's an example. If you say this ring is nice, that's an argument for buying it. Add a negation, this ring is not nice, then you get an argument for not buying it. Everybody agrees. And that comes immediately in a probabilistic setting, namely if R is an argument for C, then you can prove almost immediately that not R will decrease your belief in C, learning that not R is the case, namely you get an argument for the opposite conclusion, not buying. So you don't have to postulate the law, it's there already. Inversion law is a more complex case. So here's an illustration. It's freezing is a better argument than it's cold for a conclusion like wearing gloves. It's freezing, wear your gloves, versus it's cold, wear your gloves. And yes, if you negate them, it's not cold is a better argument than it's not freezing for the opposite conclusion, not wearing gloves or a scarf or whatever it is. The parts are good. But crucially, in the Bayesian setting, you cannot prove the law. If you write what the law is in probabilistic terms, well, you cannot prove from the fact that one argument is better than the other. If you negate them, you get the reversed order. Actually, what you prove is it's true only under certain conditions. One condition is that the weak argument must be more probable than the strong argument. So that's an actual example from Ducrot. Alex is very polite. They help clear the table and above all, clean the dishes. So the use of above all is there to show that this, but the projection of above all is a better argument than what comes before. Okay, so it's R, the strong argument, and R prime, the weak argument. And the conclusion is Alex is very polite. And indeed, if you negate the arguments, again, as in the gloves and the freezing thing, you get a reversed order. Alex not very polite, they didn't clean dishes, and above all, didn't help clear the table. Even didn't help clear the table. Fine. But what about 14? So conference X is very nice. You get a nice conference hat. That's a weak argument for a conference. I mean, it's not the weakest, but usually it's not the strongest either. That's not how you get funding to go. But the organizers invited interesting keynote speakers is a better argument. And in my worldview, it's also more probable than giving out nice hats. So here we have a weaker and also less probable argument, and a stronger but also more probable argument. And if you negate them, conference X is not very nice. They don't give you any hat. No, the invited speakers are not interested. Seems like it goes this way rather than the other way. So it's not very nice. The invited speakers are not interesting, and above all, they don't give you any help. I mean, you could say that. It's not ungrammatical, but it says something about your worldview, about conferences. Oh, yes. And so, in a way, this is a good result because this is predicted in the Bayesian setting. So the Bayesian setting actually adds to the argumentative laws. It helps us make them more precise in the way they define. So where does the original formulation of the inversion law come from? Well, because the easiest way to form an argumentative scale, form items that will form arguments that are ranked in terms of strengths, is to rely on entailment scales. Things like freezing, cold, cool. As we all know, if it's freezing, it means it's cold. If it's cold, it means it's cool, etc. And because you have those entailment patterns, what you also have mechanically is that the probabilities basically increase left to right because you have inclusion. Okay, so if one assumes the typical degree semantics for those properties, higher degrees will entail lower ones, and so probabilities will align. And so in a way, you have the conditions for the inversion law to apply, which are automatically met as soon as you take this kind of scales to form your examples, which is what happens in most of the examples that we consider. Okay, and now 3 minutes to talk about topology.
4 minutes, you had a question.
Yeah, let's deduct the question by Timothy. A topos is a pattern of reasoning stored in our cognitive resources to provide structure in discourse, communicate implicit information according to Lightholtz. And they're typically involved in antonyms, natural language arguments in which some crucial information is missing. This is the typical way of introducing a topos. So give the delivered person a tip, they carry the box all the way inside. This is the conclusion you're aiming for. But you need something to go from there to carrying a box to getting a tip. And the topos at work is something like, well, hard work deserves reward. Topoi, theories of topoi differ, but usually they recognize the following. You can entertain contradictory topoi if you want. You're not being incoherent if you do. They usually remain implicit by nature in discourse. They're also ideological because they're presented as part of the set of norms and beliefs of the community. They are not deductive, and using topoi positively, accessible topoi positively affects the credibility of your argument. So if you rely on what appears to be very common knowledge, people will tend to believe you more. And within argumentation, within language, the meaning of lexical items is thought of as the set of topoi an expression can enter in. So it's not denotational. It's just, well, where can you use this? There's no descriptive truth conditional content. And crucially, the topoi involve linguistic expressions, not logical representation, which immediately solves the stingy, thrifty issue. So I'm going to pass the formalization of topoi in the interest of time and jump to finding topoi. So how do you know? I mean, it's easy to say, oh, it's the set of topoi and expression enters it, but then how do you access this set? How do you find it? First answer by Anscombre is that, oh, you look at proverbs and sayings in the language you are interested in, and that will give you an idea of the topoi. Things like opposites attract. birds of a feather flock together will give you access to some topoi. Things that look alike tend to be attracted. But that doesn't take you very far. More recently, Ducrot develops a more articulate perspective, basically says that argumentative meaning is structuralist in a Saussurean way, meaning that the argumentative value of an expression, including lexical expression, is determined in relationship to the value of other expressions. Namely, the meaning of an expression is the set of sentences, discourses it can appear in. And if you're familiar with distributional semantics, it looks very much like this definition of meaning. Define a term by the set of environments in which you can find it. And so I will not go into the details of this, I just mention it. If you know about large language models and how those models like GPT, the thing behind ChatGPT, learn the representation that they give you when you give them a linguistic expression, essentially it's distributional. What they learn is, given a context, they learn how to guess what the word is that comes in that context. So it's something that matches Ducrot's theoretical characterization of argumentative meaning. And so large language models, they're very good playing ground to try and find the topoi that one can associate with a certain lexical term. And people like Erk and Kronis, this is exactly what they are doing. They don't call them topoi, they call them stories. Stories are the clusters that you can, that come from looking at the representation that you get with the tokens of certain items. So, summary. I've been arguing for taking into account argumentation within the semantics of natural language as a way to approach some non-descriptive parts of meaning. And I'm done claiming again that argumentative content is independent from other types of content. It exploits part of the descriptive content. It's linked to communitarian aspects, just like any other aspect of meaning can be interrelated. And then there were potential practical applications for the study of the linguistic properties of those things that are going to make us extinct very soon. Large language models. Thank you.
So we have probably less time than we can answer and address all questions in, but would you like to take your own or shall I?
No, you do it.
Okay. Questions? Oh, well, maybe I was wrong.
Yeah. No question in the discussion because I said it's a bad idea.
Thank you very much for your talk.
There's a question on the internet.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm overall very sympathetic with the view that many Bayesian programmatics come into play when we formalize the argumentative like dispositives. But I may not fully understand the way your model differs from the QUD based analysis. For example, so if I play the devil's advocate and try to defend the QUD type of person, maybe some people would say that there is a kind of hidden implicit question like interspersed in the discourse, and what you try to characterize as the kind of argumentative goals are perhaps a kind of an answer to such an implicit question in the discourse. For example, you can say that this is a nice hat. So that means by this hat or by one. So, but instead of having just the sequence to sentences, one may, I don't know, enrich the context, and maybe you can put a kind of implicit question, something like, should I buy one or should you buy one? So if the kind of the next statement is answer to that kind of should question, maybe the original QUD analysis can apply in a certain way. So if my understanding is wrong, please correct me, and if you have some comments, please elaborate. Yeah.
Thank you for your question. I agree, but I don't see the point of doing this. So I'm not so much against the QED approach, is that I don't see what you gain from it. I don't see why you should assume implicit questions when you can just do it with what you see in discourse. But mostly my point was that if you want to try and define what is at issue in terms of answering a question, then you run into some trouble. With the case of proximal adverbs, because you have things that address the QED and do it in different ways. So you keep your QED if you want, but don't use it to define what is at issue, because then you run into trouble. But then in your case, yes, of course, you could say that when a speaker says, well, this hat is nice, you should buy it. At some point, there's an implicit question that is reconstructed on the basis of what they say. But what do you gain from doing it is not so clear to me. So yes, you can. Why should you? Is my answer.
Okay, cool, thank you.
How about the issues?
Yeah, true. Someone there. I have no idea what's going on. Who raised their hand?
Yeah, she did
Yeah.
it again.
It's in Japanese, a language I
Oh,
do not
She raised
speak.
her hand.
She's raising her hand.
And then
Maybe she wants
please
to say a thing.
speak.
Oh, okay. Oh, can I ask a question? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a question about the Bayesian interpretation. Well, on slide number 16, you said A implies C. So A is an argumentative meaning and the C is a goal. And the probability of C given A is greater, definitely greater than the probability of C. But I wonder if it could be weaker, like be greater than or equal. Does it always work? Does the argumentative meaning always work?
I'm thinking.
Hmm.
I mean, if it's strictly greater, if it's equal, then you have an argument that doesn't work. So in a way, it's not an argument. So the way it's defined here, it's an effective argument is one that positively changes degrees of belief. So if you have equality, sure, you can do it, but then you consider that null arguments are arguments, and that's not what I'm trying to define here, or that's not what people in that tradition are trying to define. We define argumentation as something that has an effective change in the degrees of belief.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, I understand. Thank you.
If it turns out that what you said changed nothing in the beliefs of your audience, your argument failed. So it's not an argument.
Yeah,
Positive.
that's what the argumentative meaning is. So yeah, okay.
Look, 1, 2, 3.
You have to pick.
You do your job.
Okay, I pick me.
Oh, you
No, it's okay. I just talked about it. It's gonna be okay. No, actually, I take it back. I pick you.
Me?
Yeah.
Pikachu.
Oh, well,
Then
I wonder whether, is it all about belief?
What's in the Bayesian
Only-
perspective?
No, Bayesian, yes, but I mean, an extended, like how we should think about argumentation in language. What does it mean to alter someone's values, for example? Also, what are the imperatives and interrogatives, or rather, commands or requests and questions doing? This is because we're still in the world of updating subjective probabilities and
Mhm.
calculating
Mhm.
consequences. And I kind of wonder if there's a space where we can go beyond beliefs about facts and into judgments about values, which maybe you could boil down to beliefs, but I don't know. I just, yeah, that was my question.
So about you can have questions as conclusion, and so there's no sense in which, I mean, it would be difficult to define beliefs about the question. Yeah. But you can see in discourses that sometimes people like, you say, oh, this ring is nice, but it's expensive. Therefore, what should I do? Conclusion is a question. And so those are called erotic argumentative cases as an extra syllable. And I I proposed, for example, that those cases in which you can argue for a question if you have arguments that augment the entropy of the question, essentially. So if you give two, so that's why it works well with things with but. But gives you things that argue in opposite directions. So in the end, you've got things that make the question. In that case, you would be licensed to reconstruct the question because you see it. Yeah. The conclusion.
You made the question less resolved.
Yes, you made the question less resolved. Therefore, that can be a conclusion. So it becomes relevant to ask the question.
Speaking of conclusions.
Again. I like the
Let's thank our speaker again.